We spoke last week about spiritual formation, ministry formation, and missional formation. Coming out of our summit, we said, take hold. Okay, what are we going to take hold of? These three things: spiritual formation, ministry formation, and missional formation. As spiritual formation, as I'm formed in the image of Christ, as I want to become more and more like Him, reflect His nature, live how He lived. So what happens is, as I do that, what happens is I actually get formed into and by the church. I can't have Christ without His church. And the more I'm in the church, and the more I'm formed in the church and by the church, so I'm formed into mission. I cannot be in the church and not have a mission. Everything about the church is to equip people for mission, to reach those who are not yet saved. And the point of the point of mission, reaching those who are not saved yet, is to pull them into the church. And so those two things, you cannot have one without the other. And likewise, I cannot have spiritual formation. It's not the Christian life, the Christian journey is not just one of, it's me and Jesus, and I'm on a spiritual journey, and I want to become more like Him. That's wonderful. But part of that spiritual journey is I also get plugged into a community, a life-giving community called the church, those that give my life context. And then because I'm plugged into the church, I get mission. And so when I choose Jesus, I actually get a 3-for-1 special. When I choose Jesus, I get the church and I get mission as a byproduct. Those two things come for free. They cost me everything, but they come for free when I choose Jesus. Here's the thing. When I choose the church, I don't get Jesus. But when I choose Jesus, I get the church and I get mission. And so those three things have to exist together. I get formed I get formed into Jesus' likeness, and then I get formed into the church. Then I get formed by the church for mission. We spoke about spiritual formation, and we said that to bear fruit, Jesus says in John chapter 15, to bear fruit, you must abide in me, you must remain in me, stay in me. What He means is, Jesus is not my weekend special. Jesus is a place where I live. Jesus is the place where I remain, the place where I stay. He says, if you want to bear fruit, you must remain in me, stay in me. We said that gives us a thick trunk. And then what gives us deep roots is we are deeply rooted in the Scriptures. We are rooted in the Bible. Our faith is rooted in the Bible. It's not just, I think this is good and there's a nice philosophy there. No, it's rooted in the Bible. Deep roots and a thick trunk. But then also, I need to have heavy branches. If I want to bear fruit, I need to have heavy branches that can support and sustain fruit. Of course, there must be roots. Of course, there must be a trunk. But there must be heavy branches. And those heavy branches are the formational discipleship relationships that take place in a church. Here's the key, if you want them to. Those deeply formational discipleship relationships are available in the church for those that want them. There's no entry level, there's no requirements other than I want it. The problem is that the sad reality is many people don't seek them out. Many people actually don't want to be discipled. Jesus speaks in Matthew chapter 28 of teaching and instructing in a way of life. Teach them my way of life, how to live their lives. And most people, the disposition of too many people is, don't tell me how to live my life, I'll live my life. Whereas Jesus is instructing to us is, teach them my way of life. And so these deeply formational discipleship relationships don't take place, not because they're not on offer, but because we actually don't want them to take place. Friends, are you aware of your formational relationships? Are you aware of the relationships that form the person, that make up the person you are becoming? If you are not aware of them, you still have them. All of us have formational relationships. We have relationships that make up and that transform us, form us into the person that we are becoming. If you are not aware of them, they are consequential formational relationships, unintentional. They are just happening by themselves. Unless, I want to invite you, I want to encourage you to have intentional formational relationships. People that you are discipled by, people that you can follow their way of life. This is how I should live. See, this is not I need to find somebody who can teach me. No, a good teacher can teach. A good researcher can teach. Most people who can read can teach to some degree. This is not about information. You can get information. We're drowning in information. The church is drowning in that. What we are desperate for, what we are hungry for, is instruction and example. We need people whose lives we can follow and who can instruct us in the way of life of Jesus. The branches must be heavy, not the word. You with me? Sounds like it's heavy. It's not. Most people's formational relationships are with people, unfortunately, that don't know them and who they only know from afar. And so when our unintentional formational relationships are with people that don't know us and that we only see what is curated, what they want us to see, that is an informational relationship. It's not a formational relationship. And so it's an unintentional formation. It forms us, but not by choice. It forms us by default because we're just getting information from that. A formational relationship has to have proximity. It must be close. You need to spend time with one another, in one another's homes. Don't just listen to what I say. Observe how I live. How do I treat my wife? How do I treat my kids? When I'm under pressure, what comes out of me? What do my finances look like? What do the rest of my relationships during the week look like? What's my bedtime and awake time look like? What do I look like in all of those situations? Because when you know that, that's actually how I live. Standing on a Sunday here for 3.5 hours that I'm preaching today, I'm joking, for 30 minutes that I'm preaching today, is not how I live, right? This is just what I do for 30 minutes. How I live my life is how I live my life. And so you cannot base your thinking on how I live based on what I'm standing on a stage. You've got to be able to observe my life. And if my life, how I live, doesn't add up to what I stand and say for 30 minutes, there is a problem, and you shouldn't be following me. If the people who are forming your faith, you cannot see their way of life, do not follow them. Those formational relationships are a waste of time. They will form you into something unintentional that you don't want to become. You're just gaining information from them. It's not the Christian way. Jesus speaks of relationships where those are, he says, instruct and teach. Instruct those in a way of life. We need teaching, we need instruction, and we need example. So as we continue this journey of spiritual formation, I want to talk today about a character trait that should mark our lives: generosity. So I've called today ridiculously generous. Our culture statement calls it irrationally generous. But I want to start with the question and say, what does generosity look like to you? What do you understand of generosity? Because how we understand generosity, how we think about generosity, will determine whether we are generous or not. So either you will think of yourself as I'm already generous, therefore I don't need to think about generosity any further, or you will think generosity is beyond me. I cannot be generous, and if either of those ways of thinking, you will not be a generous person. So what I'm speaking about this morning is not finances. I'm not saying give more money. I'm talking about a person whose life is marked by generosity. So I think so many of us have occasions where we've been generous, but our lives are not necessarily marked by generosity. We know that it's not the things that we do that define us, it's the habits that we keep. See, being generous here and there and here doesn't make us generous people. That's just doing generous things. I'm not speaking about acts of generosity today. A broken clock is right twice a day. You wouldn't say that the clock is right. You wouldn't say that the clock tells the time, although the clock tells the right time twice a day. But you wouldn't say it does. So when I do generosity, and I do something generous, and I do something generous, that doesn't make me a generous person. I'm speaking about our lives being marked by generosity. So how do you know what marks your life? When people are with you, if I'm with a person, and I don't do something for them, when they leave my presence, are they still left with a taste of generosity? Are they still left with a mark of generosity, just having been with me? Then my life is marked by generosity. Otherwise, I'm just doing generous things. And we don't need more stuff to do. We've all got too much to do already. We need less to do and more to be. So I'm calling you this morning not to do generous things, but to be generous people. We have plenty of people in this community who are generous. People who are not generous in instances, but people whose lives are marked by generosity. You all know who they are. I don't need to name them by name because you love being with them. Because they're generous by nature. See, generosity is far more than money. Of course, it has financial implications, but the root of generosity is not giving. The root of generosity is actually love. And we love being around generous people actually because they are loving people. Their love is expressed through generosity. They love as God loves. So you might be thinking to yourself as you're listening to this, it's a bit of a weird time to be speaking on generosity. We're going through quite a bit, right? We got to our taps this morning in the church, we opened it, and there was water. Come on! First time in 2 weeks we had water at the church. It's an issue, right? Some of you don't have water at home. Ryan was talking this morning about a bucket bath for the 14th day in a row. It's not cool. There's pressure. We've got electricity. It's pressure. Right? At the moment, we're in election season, which means we are being treated as commodities by politicians, and they're trading on our misery currently. We've got water, we've got electricity, we've got elections and politicians. There's things going on the world stage that are affecting us and our country profoundly that are completely out of our control. There is a lot that's going on. It's a bit of a weird time to be speaking on generosity. Surely we should be speaking about taking care of ourselves and just trying a bit harder and close the wagons. Let's get a bit tighter in ourselves. No, friends, it's the perfect time to speak on generosity right now. And you know how I know that it's the right time to speak on generosity? Because you were created to be generous. You were created by God to be generous. Because you were created in God's image, and God is generous. The root of generosity is love, which means you cannot be love and not be generous. Scripture teaches us that God is love. And because God is love, that love is expressed through generosity. See, it's possible for you to do generous things and not be in love, but it's impossible for you to be love and not do generous things. That's why I'm not speaking to you about doing more generous things. I'm speaking to you about being a more generous person. So when times are tough like they are at the moment, it's an ideal time to preach on being generous, because we never want to be people who do generous things, but people whose lives are generous, rooted in love. So what I'm speaking about has financial implications, but it's far more than that. This isn't a fundraising drive. This is not the church asking for more money. This is a pastor standing in front of his people saying, can we be more like the God that we serve, who expresses his love through generosity? Can we be more like that? Generosity is God's love made evident and obvious. And you know what? It's contagious. Both love and generosity is contagious. The more time that you and I spend around people who are generous, the more time you and I spend around people whose lives are characterized by love, the more loving and the more generous we become. Friends, what if the most contagious thing to come out of your life over the next 6 months wasn't something that you picked up in hospital or at school? What if the most contagious thing to come out of your life was was love expressed through generosity? What would happen to your life if the most contagious thing to come from you in the next 6 months would be love expressed through generosity? What would happen to the world around you? What would happen to the people around you, your friends, your family, your spouse, your children, your work colleagues, those you are at school with? What would happen to them? What would happen to your world? Do you know how I know that you're called to be generous? I'd like to look at a few examples in the Bible and then the implications for us. So we're going to start in Genesis chapter 1. As Mary Poppins taught us, a very good place to start. No, that wasn't Mary Poppins. It was Mary Poppins. Sound of Music. Sound of Music. Very good place to start, the very beginning. Genesis chapter 1. Verse 11 says this, "Then God said, let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds. And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it, according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. There was evening, there was morning, and it was the third day." So we see that on the third day, God creates vegetation, but He doesn't just say, "I created vegetation." He's very, very specific about how it's worded here. He says God creates vegetation that bears seeds, and then He creates trees that bear fruit, not just trees with fruit with seed in it. This is generous because these things, everything that God has created, doesn't have to rely on God for new life. He creates for His glory and His enjoyment. And then He says, "I will give you sun, I'll give you water, and I'll give you the means to reproduce. I'll give you the means to produce life for yourself." So I'm going to create vegetation and trees and plants and stuff. And then when we need more vegetation and more trees and more fruits and whatever, you don't need to come back to me and say, we need more trees. God, there's an order for 10 trees. Can you create 10 more trees because we're running short of apples this month? Create us more. No, he says, I've given you the ability to reproduce life for yourself. See, it's not generous for us to give and create a situation where people are constantly reliant on us, on our generosity and our goodness. All we're doing is creating a power dynamic that puts us at the top and people that we are helping at the bottom. Being generous means creating and giving the ability to reproduce life for themselves. So you might have heard the expression, give a man a fish and you'll feed him for a day. Teach him to fish and you'll feed him for a lifetime. And I think so often we've used that as an excuse not to give people a fish. Because we've said that's actually not what they need. But what generosity looks like is we give people a fish so that they can eat today, and then we teach them to fish. We buy them a rod, we buy them a fishing license because those things are expensive. Then we take them on our boat to the fishing spots that only the locals know about, the best fishing spots. We teach them then how to bait a hook. We teach them how to cast. You can tell I'm an excellent fisherman. I know all the lingo. But we teach them how to fish. We give them the means and the ability, not only the means, but the ability to reproduce for themselves. When God creates, he doesn't say, and I'm going to create, and you'll constantly be dependent on me to reproduce. And he says, I give you the means and the ability to do it on your own. See, love expressed through generosity empowers people to provide for themselves by giving them what they need. And again, this is not just financial. We have to create relationships where people can learn to self-regulate their own emotions without being constantly reliant on us. We have to create relationships where people can learn to go to the well of life for themselves. We are not a conduit for their healing and health and wholeness. And we set up, again, this power dynamic where people must come to us in order, and we, in essence, withhold life from them when we create that power dynamic. No, when God creates, he creates the ability and the means and the ability, and he gives it. Now you can produce for yourself. Here, I'll give you sun, I'll give you water, and I'll give you seed. The key ingredients. All you have to do is bear fruit. That's being generous out of a root of love. Let's go to verse 20. I'm going to read this quite quickly so you don't need to follow along if you're not able to. Then God said, let the water teem with living creatures and let birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky. So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living thing with which the water teems and that moves about on it according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the waters in the seas and let the birds increase on the earth. And there was evening and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals according to its kind. And it was good. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Have you ever stopped and thought, why does God create so many animals? I know that you've stopped and thought, why did God create certain animals? Mozzies, flies, cockroaches, hard-eaters at 4 a.m. You've laid there and thought, why did God create certain animals? But have you ever thought to yourself, why did God create so many animals? I'm a risk assessor by nature, and so I'm going to just look at the little ecosystem and I say, okay, what can we get away with? Right? We probably need 5 or 6, maybe 7 things in the ecosystem. The grass gets eaten by the insect, gets eaten by the bird, gets eaten by the animal, and then that thing, it doesn't need 10 million billion for an ecosystem to survive. To be very frugal, it just needs a couple, maybe 6 or 7 in the ecosystem for it to survive. And yet God creates far more than is necessary. I don't know if you've ever thought about that. We are currently, today, discovering new species at a rate of 18,000 a year. 18,000 new species a year. So depending on which statistical model you use, scientists estimate that we currently know between 20 and 25% of all living creatures have been discovered. This is not the 1500s we're speaking about. This is namhlanje, today, 2024. 20 to 25% of living creatures have been have been discovered and understood. Again, they extrapolate that forward and say there's probably around 7 billion species to still discover. 7 billion. So if we do a little bit of maths, 7 billion divided by 18,000 gives us 389,000 years to discover the species that are currently on Earth. You can trust me, I did the maths. After I'd Googled how many zeros were in a billion. 389,000 years to discover all the species that are currently on Earth. There are species going extinct that we don't know anything about because they've been created and then disappeared without us even knowing that they were there. It's a lot of numbers and a lot of animals. John, what's the point? Friends, when God creates, He creates more than enough. He creates more than is necessary. He's generous. His love is expressed through generosity. He gave more species that can be counted by man for no reason other than beauty. He creates animals and makes so many different kinds of shapes and sizes and colors simply because it's beautiful. God's love is expressed through generosity and the beauty of His creation. Why is beauty important? Why is beauty generous? Beauty is the antidote to trauma. Beauty is the antidote to trauma. And so before the trauma of sin has even entered the world, God makes provision for it through beauty. Not just a little bit of beauty, more beauty than is necessary. Before sin has even entered the world. He says, I know that sin will enter the world, mankind, creation. You are going to need beauty to recover from the trauma of sin. And so I'm going to create more beauty than is necessary, more beauty than you can count in 10,000 lifetimes. I'm going to create it simply so that you can recover from the trauma caused by sin. Friends, God is generous in His creation. Then He says in verse 26 of Genesis chapter 1, let us make mankind in our own image and in our likeness. That's not God speaking to somebody else. That's the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit speaking in the third person. Let us make man in our image, in our likeness. In other words, let us give man, what we have just created, the same nature and characteristics that we have. And then everything that I've so generously and lavishly and extravagantly created, I'm going to give it to man just for his enjoyment. Simply for his enjoyment. See, God's love is expressed through generosity in His giving of what was His to somebody else. Creation was His. And His love is expressed in the giving of what was His to somebody else. Again, this has financial implications, but it's certainly not only. See, your time is yours. Your skills are yours. Your experience is yours. This is also why God doesn't call tithing generous. He says the tithe isn't yours anyway, it's mine. Generosity is giving of something that is yours to somebody else. So being created in God's image means that we're created to have the same nature and characteristics that He does. For the purpose of today, it's generosity, but that also means that we have free will. Man is the only created being that has free will, the only created being that has the ability to self-determine. Everything else that is created doesn't have the ability to choose one thought over another. All other created beings are subject to their base instinct. When a lion sees an impala, he cannot help but hunt it. He can't think to himself, today I don't feel like impala. I feel like a vegetable. No matter how many times his wife tells him that it's more healthy for him. He does not have that ability to self-determine. Only man has the ability to self-determine and free will. Why is giving free will generous? Because when God gives man free will, he does it knowing that some of those men will use their free will to not choose Him. He does it knowing that some of those men will use their free will to crucify His Son. And yet He still does it. He still gives it. Friends, sometimes your generosity will cost you more than you thought it would, and we still need to do it anyway. We still need to be prepared to be generous. Because that's how we were created, in the image of God. So God is generous in creation, And then he creates us in his image, created to express love through generosity. So again, I ask the question, what does generosity look like to you? So God is generous in creation, but he's also generous in redemption. Redemption means simply to put things back the way that they should be, to restore an imbalance. So if I go to the shops and I buy a gift voucher for somebody, we say when that person goes to the shops with that gift voucher, the language that we use is they go to redeem that gift voucher. Until they redeem that gift voucher at a shop, there is an imbalance. I've paid a price, I've paid money to the shops, I haven't received goods or services. All I've received is a piece of paper. I've received a promise of goods or services, and if it sits at that person's house and they never take it to the shops, there is eternally an imbalance. A price has been paid, and yet nothing has been received. Until they go to the shops where they give that voucher in, then there's goods or services, and that it's been redeemed. All right? So Jesus has paid a price on our behalf, and it's offered to us as a gift certificate. It's free life for free on our behalf. What we have to do is we have to take, in essence, that gift voucher to the shops and redeem it. Allow ourselves to be redeemed. The price that Jesus has paid on our behalf, say, thank you very much. I would like everything that comes with that. That's what redemption is. The price that Jesus has paid for us, we take it. We say, thank you very much for the free gift of life. I will take it. I'd like to use it today, please. That's redemption. God is generous in redemption. And here's why. If you are not a follower of Jesus, if you haven't been in church for a long time, you still might know this scripture. John chapter 3, verse 16 says this. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. Whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. See, God is generous in the work of redemption because he gives his only Son. Some of us have more clothes than we can wear. If it's for me, just tell them I'm preaching. It's all right. It's okay. Some of us have more clothes than we can wear, and we think that we're generous because we're giving them away instead of selling them. So I remember coming onto this property a few years ago, and I was chatting with a lady before the service, and when I was speaking with her, a little boy walked past, and he had no shoes on. Thankfully, it wasn't one of my children, because they choose to come to church, some of them without shoes on. But this little boy had no shoes, and she stopped him and said, hey, where's your shoes? She knew them. Where's your shoes? And he said, I don't have any shoes. So she said, okay. While I was with her, she bent down, took her shoes off, gave her shoes to the boy, off he went on his way. She spent the day on the property, went home that day without shoes. I learned a lesson about generosity from that lady that day. It's not generous to give out of excess. It's generous to give when it's your one and only. See, for God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. You know what God calls giving out of excess? Justice. It's right for us to give out of excess. We should give from what we have left. But God doesn't call that generosity. He calls that justice. We must be just, but also we must be generous. So our culture in this family is that we are led by irrational generosity. And we went backwards and forwards a few times when we were wording our culture statements with the wording of that. Should it be irrational? We are led by generosity, or we are led by irrational generosity. We struggled with that word a bit. Like if you're applying for a job perhaps at an accountancy firm, the number one special skill on your CV when it comes to dealing with money probably isn't going to be irrational. Right? I'm irrational when it comes to money. That's not the number one skill. We landed on the word irrational because I don't believe that it's generous unless it doesn't make sense. See, it makes sense to give out of your excess, which God doesn't call generosity. He calls that justice. It's only generous if it doesn't make sense. God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son. Giving is only generous when it doesn't make sense. So God is generous in creation, and he is generous in redemption. I want to close with a beautiful story of a person who became generous because of the love of Jesus. We said that the root of generosity is love, and when we encounter the love of Jesus, it should make us generous. That's why I ask the question, what does generosity look like to you? Because that's a good measure of whether or not we've encountered the love of Jesus. Are we generous? Friends, I think the church is far too full of men and women who have not encountered the love of Jesus and so therefore are not generous. People who come to church often, but have not encountered the love of Jesus. And because we have not encountered the love of Jesus, we are not generous people. I want to end with a story in Luke chapter 19. That's not a heavy, that's an encouragement. Luke chapter 19 is a story, if you've been a part of this church for a while, you should know it quite well, the story of Zacchaeus, where we get our Sowing September concept from. Luke 19, Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief collector and he was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he couldn't see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people who saw this began to mutter, he's gone to be the guest of a sinner, Jesus, hanging out with sinners again. What does he think he's doing? But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, he said to the Lord, look, in the crowd, at his house, he stands up and says to everyone, he says to Jesus, here and now, I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I'll pay him back 4 times the amount. Jesus says to him, today salvation has come to this house because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. So I chose to close with this story because it emphasizes what I've been saying. We were created to be generous because we were created in God's image. But when we encounter the love of Jesus, it's evidenced by generosity. Friends, there's too many people in the church who were created to be generous, but are not being generous because they have not encountered the love of Jesus. See, Christians don't give to get, we don't give to win some sort of favor from God. Christians give, generous people give as a byproduct of their personal transformation. When I meet Jesus, when I encounter the love of Jesus, I'm transformed. Giving becomes a byproduct. Giving, being a generous person is not something that people have to keep reminding me, remember to be generous, remember to be, no, it's a byproduct of how I'm being transformed into the nature of Christ. The more like Jesus I become, the more generous I become. Friends, if you think of yourself as a mature Christian and you are not a generous person, I'm not speaking of finances only. If you are not generous, you might need to rethink your maturity. Friends, are you generous with your time? Are you generous with your experience and expertise? Are you generous with your words? Remember, we don't want to be people who do generous things, but we want to be generous people. Because I've encountered the love of God, I'm generous. Because I was created in God's image, I'm generous because He is a generous God. We want to land our sermons this year with either a private practice or a public expression of faith. One of the things that makes Anthem, that makes this church a family, is that we choose to practice our private faith in a similar way, and we choose to express our public faith in a similar way. That's what makes us a family. That's our DNA. That's how we do things in this family. We have a way of faith. We have a way of life. It's one of the reasons that we are reading the scriptures together. If you are not a part of our Bible reading plan, speak to somebody at the hospitality desk. They will help you to join. You can onboard at any time in the month and join, and just come and join from wherever you are in the year. Awesome, do it. That's one of the reasons we're doing that, because we want our private practice and our public expression of faith to be similar. That's what makes us a family. Perhaps you've been coming out for a while, and you still might feel like an outsider, not as if you're part of the family for whatever reason. One of the best ways that you can start feeling a part of the family is to start imitating our faith, to start imitating our way of life, how we practice our faith in private and how we express our faith in public. Start to do that. You will immediately feel part of the family, because that's what you will be. This week's private practice is the practice of being generous. The practice of being generous, becoming a person whose life is marked by generosity. Can we take a minute to pause here? Can you assess your own generosity? What does being generous mean to you? And more importantly, could the word generous be used to describe you? Where is God perhaps asking you to be more generous? Do you give people the ability to reproduce without you, as well as the means to do so? Or do you create a relationship where they are dependent on you? Do you give more than is necessary, just for the sake of beauty? Or do you give just enough? Do you give the gift of self-determination or free will, knowing that it might cost you more later? Do you give only out of your excess? Or do you give your only, what is precious to you? Friends, as I've been redefining what it means to be generous, I've found myself short of where I want to be, short of where I should be, and ultimately, short of where I want to be. I know, I want to just emphasize, I'm not only speaking about finances today. I know many generous people, and very few of them are wealthy. I trust that God is speaking to you, even right now, about being generous, where you can be generous. I pray that you would be people, that we would be people who are marked by generosity out of conviction, because we were created to be generous. What it means to be a Christian is that I place all of my trust in Jesus as the only one who's able to save me, the only one who makes it possible and through whom I can have a relationship with God that I was created to have. It means I repent and ask Him for His forgiveness, His grace, so that I can be forgiven and begin to live my life the same way that Jesus lived His life, to obey His teachings. I want to give an opportunity for you to respond this morning. Either, it's two groups of people at the same time. Either you have never repented and asked Jesus to forgive you, to make you a new creation, or you perhaps have done that, but you have not encountered the love of Jesus. And so you've realized this morning, today I was created to be generous, but because I haven't encountered enough regularly, abided in Jesus, I haven't abided in the love of Jesus. Therefore, I have recognized my shortcomings in generosity. If either of those categories are you, I'm not going to ask you to do anything other than raise your hand. And I'd love to pray for you this morning. It would be my privilege. Is there anybody?